I held him again this morning. Daniel, my grandson. 2 months and 4 days old, which at his age is a significant proportion of his total experience of existence, and which, from where I sit, 70 years old, sitting in a coffee shop I first came to when this child's mother was not yet an idea, when the war had been over for 2 years and I had an audition on Thursday and 60% of hope, from where I sit, 2 months is the blink of something. He has Thomas's patience in his face. That is the most accurate thing I can say about what I see when I look at Daniel's face. Not Thomas's features. Features are distributed randomly from the genetic lottery, and Daniel's features are his own, and his mother's, and his father's, in proportions I can't parse yet. But the quality. The quality of Thomas's patience, which is not passivity. Thomas is not passive. Thomas has strong views on architecture and coffee and the proper way to make a bed, but a kind of settled willingness to receive the world as it presents itself before deciding what to do about it. Daniel has that. 2 months old, he already has that. Clara named him Daniel, which I knew she was going to do before she told me. In the way you know certain things about the people you've raised when you've known them long enough and closely enough that their interior logic has become legible to you. She told me the name in the hospital, holding him herself for the first time, and she looked at me with an expression that was asking whether it was all right, whether the name landed the way she intended, whether she had done a right thing. I said, yes, because yes was the right answer, and also because it was the only word I could produce at that moment, which was not a bad reason to choose it. She named him for Danny Reardon, who has been dead for 41 years, who was 25 years old when he died in the Pacific, who had dark hair and a laugh that started slow and then arrived all at once with complete commitment, who kept his photograph in the drawer of my bedside table for 4 decades. The photograph is still there. Now there is also Daniel, 2 months old, with Thomas's patience and a name that carries a specific weight, and who has no idea, yet, of either the weight or the patience required to carry the weight. But who will learn? Because that is what people do with the things they're given before they understand them. Come, sit down with me. 1985 is... There is a great deal to say about 1985. There is also a great deal to feel about it. And I want to try to honor both of those things, which requires staying in the chair long enough to get through them. Let's begin with the part that frightens me most. I need to tell you about something that is happening in New York right now, in 1985, that I cannot describe to you as an abstraction, because it is not an abstraction. It is happening in specific buildings, on specific streets. It is happening to specific people whose names I know, and to many more whose names I don't. It is happening, in the specific autumn of this year, at a pace that has been accelerating since 1981, when it was first clinically described, and it is happening, and this is the thing I cannot say quietly, with an inadequacy of response from the government that is proportionate to the inadequacy of the government's regard for the people most affected. Acquired immune deficiency syndrome. The name was given in 1982. The disease was observed earlier, in 1981, in San Francisco and New York, in communities of gay men, in a pattern of opportunistic infections that healthy immune systems repel and that compromised ones cannot. The Centers for Disease Control reported on it first as a curiosity, then as a pattern, then as an emergency that required coordinated response. The coordinated response did not come quickly enough. I want to be specific about who I am talking about when I say not quickly enough, because that phrase can dissolve into abstraction in a way that allows comfortable distance, and I will not allow comfortable distance here. I am talking about a director I worked with in 1969, whose name I will not give because I have not asked his family's permission, and they deserve that courtesy. He died in March. He was 51 years old. He was one of the people who understood best what theater was for, not as entertainment, not as cultural artifact, but as the specific space in which human beings practice the art of being witnessed by one another. And I watched the disease take that understanding from the world, along with everything else that belonged to him. I am talking about two actors from my early career years, who I will also not name. Both gone in the last 18 months. One of them played the servant in the production where I first understood what it meant to be in a scene rather than in a performance. The other was the person backstage who first told me about Harriet, the agent who changed everything. Both of them gone. Both of them in their 50s. I am talking about the village, where Elise had her studio, where I went on Wednesday afternoons for decades. The village in 1985 is grieving in a way that is visible if you know how to look at it. Not in the dramatic, demonstrable way of a city that has received a single catastrophic blow, but in the accumulated, ongoing, daily way of a community that is losing its members faster than it can name what it is losing to. I am talking about a disease for which there is currently no treatment that stops it, for which there is currently no cure, for which there is currently a government. And I will say this plainly, because plainness is what this requires. A government that has been, for 4 years, largely silent. Ronald Reagan, who became president in 1981 and who is currently in his second term, did not publicly mention AIDS until September of this year. September 1985. 4 years after it was clinically described. 47,000 Americans diagnosed. 12,000 dead. September 1985 was the first time the President of the United States said the word AIDS. Rock Hudson died in October, 2 weeks after the President's first public mention. Rock Hudson, the film star, the man whom the public knew as the face of a certain kind of handsome American masculinity. A man whose career I had observed for decades from my specific professional vantage point. Rock Hudson died of AIDS, and his death made it impossible for a certain category of American to pretend that this disease was happening to people unlike themselves. I have complicated feelings about this. Not about Rock Hudson, who deserves only compassion. About the mechanism by which this became visible. About the specific American requirement that a person be legible to the dominant culture before their suffering registers as real to that culture. The gay men dying in the village and in San Francisco since 1981 had not been legible enough. The drug users and the hemophiliacs and the others who had been infected through various routes had not been legible enough. It took Rock Hudson. I have spent my professional life studying how visibility works. Who gets to be seen? Who gets to be the face of what? How the apparatus of public attention decides what it pays attention to. I know this mechanism well. I understand how it functions. Understanding how it functions does not make it less terrible. The people who were dying since 1981 were not less dead because Rock Hudson had not yet died. The disease was not less of an emergency in 1982 because the people most affected by it were not the people who controlled the apparatus of response. The inadequacy of the response cannot be explained as ignorance. By 1983, the scientists knew enough to know what was needed. What was missing was not knowledge. What was missing was the will. And the will was missing because of who was dying. I am 70 years old. I grew up in a city where certain truths about the people living in it were managed by the apparatus of public decorum into invisibility. I know what managed invisibility costs. I have watched it cost lives in various configurations over the course of my adult life. This is the most direct and most devastating version of that cost I have seen. There is something else happening in New York in 1985 that I need to name alongside AIDS, because they are not unrelated. They share a root in the question of which people's suffering is visible and whose suffering is managed into abstraction. Crack cocaine. Crack appeared in certain New York neighborhoods beginning around 1984 and spread with the specific speed of something that was both genuinely addictive and genuinely affordable. More affordable than powder cocaine, accessible at a price point that put it within reach of communities that powder cocaine's economics had previously excluded. The speed of the spread has been, to watch from the outside, terrifying in the specific way that things are terrifying when you can see what is coming and cannot change its trajectory. The neighborhoods where crack has taken hold are not the Upper West Side where I live, not Midtown where I work, not the parts of the city that the newspapers cover when they write about quality of life, or that the real estate listings describe when they talk about desirable locations. The neighborhoods where crack is hitting hardest are Harlem, the South Bronx, East New York, Bedford-Stuyvesant, the parts of the city that are majority Black and Latino, that are lower income, that have been systematically underserved by every municipal investment for decades. I watch the city's response to this, and I compare it to the city's response to other addiction crises I have lived through. In the 1950s, there was a significant heroin epidemic in New York. The heroin epidemic of the 1950s affected primarily Black communities, primarily poor communities, primarily the same parts of the city that crack is affecting now. The response was law enforcement and incarceration. In the 1970s, there was a significant increase in heroin use among veterans returning from Vietnam. This heroin use affected a different population, white veterans, men who had served their country. And the response included, in addition to law enforcement, significant investment in treatment, in mental health services, in the acknowledgement that addiction was a medical condition with contributing factors that a humane society was obligated to address. I am watching what happens when crack cocaine arrives in a Black neighborhood versus what I know would happen and what has happened when equivalent substances arrived in white ones. The difference in response is the difference in who the city has decided to protect versus who it has decided to manage. This is 1985. I am 70 years old. I have been watching this city make these decisions for 5 decades. The consistency of the pattern is not a coincidence. The consistency of the pattern is a policy. I need to give you something lighter now. Not to balance the scales. There is no balancing the scales in a year that has AIDS and crack and the accumulating evidence of a city that has not solved its fundamental questions about who it protects. But because 1985 is not only those things, and because the lighter things are also real and also matter, and because Jack would have had something to say about a person who could spend an entire hour in a coffee shop without once letting the absurdity of the decade have its moment. In 1984, Apple Computer Company released a computer called the Macintosh. To announce the Macintosh, they ran an advertisement during the Super Bowl. The advertisement showed a woman, a runner, an athlete, sprinting through a dystopian crowd of gray, uniform people watching a television screen on which a large, authoritarian figure was speaking. The woman threw a hammer. The screen shattered. The gray people looked up. The advertisement ended with the words, "On January 24th, Apple Computer will introduce Macintosh, and you'll see why 1984 won't be like 1984. The advertisement was referencing George Orwell's novel about totalitarianism, surveillance, and the control of information by a central authority. The advertisement was suggesting that Apple Computer was the runner with the hammer, that the Macintosh was the act of liberation. I watched this advertisement at Thomas's suggestion. He had heard about it from colleagues at his firm who had seen it, and found it either brilliant or preposterous, with opinion dividing roughly along generational lines. I watched it and I thought several things. First, this is extraordinary marketing. Second, someone at this company has read Orwell. Third, I am not entirely certain that a consumer electronics company positioning itself as the liberation of the individual from totalitarian information control is, I want to find the right word, internally consistent, given that consumer electronics companies are themselves corporations that collect information about their users and operate according to the logic of market consolidation rather than the logic of individual empowerment. Fourth, the computer is beautiful. That fourth thought arrived unexpectedly, and I want to honor it because beauty is information. Clara brought a Macintosh home, or rather to James's apartment, which is now also her apartment, which still requires a slight adjustment of my spatial imagination, and she let me sit in front of it for approximately 40 minutes while she explained how it worked. It had a screen, a small screen by any eventual standard. But at the time in 1985, in a world where most computers were operated through text commands that required a specific vocabulary of typed instructions, the Macintosh had pictures. Little pictures. A picture of a folder to represent a folder. A picture of a trash can for things you wanted to discard. A picture of a clock for the clock. You moved things with a small device called a mouse. You moved the mouse on the table, and a corresponding arrow moved on the screen. And you pointed the arrow at the picture you wanted, and you clicked a button on the mouse, and the thing happened. I sat in front of this for 40 minutes, and I thought about several things. I thought about the typewriter, the physical resistance of the keys, the sound of the carriage return, the way the XXXX of a crossed-out word remained visible in the text as evidence of the thinking that had led to the correction. The way writing on a typewriter required a certain physical commitment. You couldn't hover, you couldn't delete without leaving a trace. Every word was a small investment in physical action. I thought about what changes when the physical commitment is removed. When the word is gone the moment you press delete and leaves no trace. When the writing is simultaneously more fluid and more weightless. I don't know yet whether this is a loss or a gain. I know it is a change. I know the change is large. I can feel the scale of it the way I felt the scale of the television in 1947. The specific sensation of being in the presence of something that is going to alter the texture of daily experience in ways that will only become clear when you're living inside the alteration. Clara showed me that you could write on it. I wrote a sentence. I looked at the sentence on the screen, luminous and weightless, with no trace of the effort it had taken. I thought, this is interesting. I need to think about this for a long time. I want to talk about money. Specifically, I want to talk about the relationship between money and the city I live in, and what that relationship has become in 1985. Because the relationship has changed in ways that are visible from my corner table, and that seem to me worth examining from the specific vantage point of someone who has lived in this city since 1915, and who has watched it go through its various economic seasons. The word this year is yuppie. Young urban professional. The word is used descriptively and mockingly, and with a range of emotional registers, depending on whether the speaker is a yuppie or is observing yuppies from outside. But in all its registers, it describes the same phenomenon. A generation of young professionals, primarily in finance and law and the growing technology sector, who are making more money than their age cohort had previously made in those sectors, who are spending that money in specific and visible ways, and who are, by their presence and their spending and the neighborhoods they have chosen, changing the texture of certain parts of New York. The parts of New York they are choosing are the Upper West Side, parts of Brooklyn that were previously not destinations, the neighborhoods where artists had moved when artists needed affordable space, which always means neighborhoods that were previously too poor to be desirable to people who could afford something else. The artists make the neighborhoods interesting. The interesting neighborhoods attract people who have money. The people who have money raise the rents. The artists leave. The pattern has a name now: gentrification. I live on the Upper West Side. I have lived here since before gentrification was a vocabulary item. I have watched the neighborhood change in the way that all New York neighborhoods change. The specific restaurants that appear and disappear, the storefronts that turn over, the people on the streets at different hours. In the 1970s, when the city was in fiscal crisis and the neighborhood was less expensive than it would eventually become, the Upper West Side had a particular quality: a density of artists and academics and people who needed affordable space for living and working in proximity to the cultural institutions of the city. In 1985, the Upper West Side has a different quality. The butcher where I had shopped for 20 years closed last spring. The space has become a wine store with recessed lighting and labels I don't recognize at prices that require a moment of internal calculation before commitment. The Italian restaurant where Thomas and I celebrated our anniversary for a decade is still there. The same family, the same food, the same slightly aggressive attentiveness that I have always found charming. But next to it is now a new restaurant that describes its food as New American, which I have come to understand means expensive ingredients prepared without the kind of excess that might be mistaken for an attempt to please. I am not entirely opposed to change. I have lived in New York for 70 years, and New York is nothing if not the production of continuous change. And I made my peace long ago with the reality that the city I loved at 32 was not identical to the city I live in at 70, and that this is not a betrayal, but simply what cities do, which is become what the people who live in them make of them. What I am examining, carefully, without arriving prematurely at a conclusion, is whether the specific change of 1985 is different in kind from the changes that preceded it. Whether the wealth that is moving into certain neighborhoods is producing a city that has more room for more kinds of people, or a city that has room primarily for people who have a certain relationship to money. I think I know the answer. I am not yet ready to say it with the certainty it would require. MTV launched in 1981. Music television, a cable channel that broadcast music videos around the clock, a format that had existed in various forms in various markets, but that in August 1981, in America, with 24 hours of programming and cable distribution, became something new. I want to tell you what a music video is, for anyone who is encountering the concept from a sufficient remove that the explanation is useful. A music video is a film. A short film, 3, 4, sometimes 5 minutes, made to accompany a song. Not a film that tells the same story as the song, necessarily, or even a film that is literally about the song's subject matter. A film that exists in conversation with the song, that creates an image world for the song to inhabit, that gives the song a face. In 1947, when I first sat at this table, music existed without faces. I mean this literally. The musicians on the radio, the singers, the band leaders, the jazz musicians whose work I've described as the thing that makes the hair on your arm stand up, existed, for most of their listeners, as voices and instruments only. You heard them. You formed an image of them that was your own, derived from the music, from whatever photographs you might have seen in newspapers or magazines, from the specific work of your own imagination, which is an underrated faculty and one that music, more than any other art form, has traditionally activated. The music video changes this. The music video says, here is the face, here is the body, here is the gesture and the expression and the environment. Here is the visual world that the music inhabits, brought to you pre-formed, requiring no work of imagination from you, only the work of reception. I watch this with complicated feelings, not because the videos are bad. Some of them are extraordinary. And I say this as someone who has spent 50 years thinking about what visual storytelling can do and how it can do it. Michael Jackson's Thriller, which was released in 1983, and which at 14 minutes is less a music video than a short film. Thriller is a piece of work that understands the relationship between image and music at a level of sophistication that most filmmakers don't reach. I watched Thriller. I watched it with Clara, who was 26 and who watched it with the specific focus of her generation, which is the focus of people for whom this format is native rather than acquired, for whom the conversation between image and music requires no translation. I said to her when it was over, "He's extraordinary." She said, "You sound surprised." I said, "I'm not surprised. I've been watching performers for 50 years and I know extraordinary when I see it. I am adjusting." She said, "To what?" I said, "To the fact that I might have been slightly wrong about something." She said, "That's big." I said, "Don't make a production of it." What I had been slightly wrong about was this. I had believed, with the conviction of someone whose primary musical formation happened in the jazz era, that music was better when it existed without a face, that the visual component, however skillfully produced, necessarily diminished the imaginative space that the music alone created. Thriller suggested that this was not a universal truth. Thriller suggested that sometimes the image and the music can do something together that neither can do alone, that the conversation between them is not zero-sum, is not a case of the visual taking from the oral, but a genuine collaboration that creates something that exceeds the capabilities of either component in isolation. I am 70 years old. I am capable of adjusting my positions in response to evidence. This is something I consider a professional virtue.